Welcome to Banner Systems Training Part 2, and I'm your host, Crystal Baker. This is using Banner version 8.22.1 and was made in April 2015, so if you're listening long after that date, I would recommend finding the new financial aid director and demanding an update, since these Banner forms change about every 6 months. And if not, hey, great news, that means I am still employed. So, moving on. What is Banner? Well, the folks at Ellucian would say that it's an integrated flow of information, but we prefer the term Student Information System. That means it's a set of forms that house tables that are joined by common elements. In other words, it's a database. Common elements include things like first name, last name, aid year, ID number, etc. So let's look at one of the forms, our favorite, Wrap Award. You can see there's all kinds of data elements on this form, like the ones I just mentioned, name, ID, year, etc. And they are all arranged in a nice compact way so that we can see lots of elements in one semi-graphically pleasing display. But if you actually look at this stuff the way that it's organized in our database, it is much more like a spreadsheet with different tables that we can use to organize our data. Here's Wrap Award for one student from the database view. So if we zoom in, you can see that all of the fields are represented here, even if they're null. So when you start to think about all of the different Banner forms like being organized like spreadsheets, it starts to make more sense. So if Banner is really just a filing system for data, how can we get to the data fields that we need? Well, that's what the menu is for. When you open the financial aid menu, you can see all of the various functions that the financial aid module actually performs. This is a graphical representation of the way that information flows through Banner. This flow is similar to the part 1 video that you just watched. So we'll start with record creation, which happens during the data load. Then need analysis performed to deliver an EFC. Then they go through tracking. Meanwhile, we're looking at things like EDE comment codes, NSLDS flags, and information from the student module like enrollment. Then our systems team will actually set up the funds in funds management, and the student application goes through the rest of groupings, budgeting, and packaging. Lastly, we have awarding and disbursement, and then of course student employment, which has to be its own module because it is just so wonky. Fortunately, Banner organizes everything in the order that it happens in. So let's go back to our menu and compare it with the flowchart. I've grayed out the modules that we don't use. The first couple of sections house forms and processes used to do data load and need analysis. The next section houses groupings, followed by awarding and disbursement, and then EDE. The next functions are truly informational in nature, dealing with system-wide communication, Banner setup, and cross-module information. And of course, lastly, we have the portal setup. Okay, just for a reference here, I'm going to show you the flowchart again. And then our menu. So let's open the first folder, Applicant Processing. The first few forms show you information about the ICER. The next few in the list are used to impact processes. For example, CVO applications come in on paper but then must be used for applicant processing. We store that information on ROSDIF, user-defined fields, so that we can then analyze the student's eligibility and financial need from that data field. In the Need Analysis folder, we can view transaction-level detail and data used to calculate the EFC and Pell. There are also options for schools that use the CSS profile, which we don't use. Next are the forms where other information from the feds are stored. In Requirements Tracking, this folder contains detail on how we use requirements to prevent packaging, disbursement, or simply how we convey messages to the student. In Budgeting, these forms help us determine the cost of attendance. We can either do this by aid year or by period. Also, it's worth noting that ROAIMP stands for Applicant Immediate Processing. This means we are immediately running the student through the groupings jobs, so that's why you'll see it in almost all of the groupings folders. Packaging and disbursement have some helpful forms, such as Wrap Award, RACOM, Roy Disby. The rest of the forms are used during New Year setup to create institutional scholarships and, of course, collect information about how the student has been paid. Next, we're going to skip a couple of modules since these deal with New Year setup, and that isn't something we can really train during a 6-minute video. Okay, so going to common functions. Well, we use these forms to find a person or group. They're mostly for reporting purposes. Next to student shared data, that means functions that are also available in the student section of Banner. These are modified versions of student forms that cull together information that is relevant for financial aid. So for example, ResiHist is the financial aid version of SHA-Term. RSISTDN is basically the financial aid version of Sagastian, etc., etc. Loan processing is where we create files to send to COD for direct loans. Our loan department lives and breathes with these forms. RAPL.org contains a lot of information that you see listed here. Okay, so you made it through the painful part. Now I'm going to show you the fun Banner tricks that I've learned from working with the system over the couple of years. First things first, I promised you this during your first video. Why in the world are the forms named the goofy way they're named? Well, the first letter is the letter that identifies the system that owns the form. So all R, that stands for resources. So for whatever reason they gave us the letter R, those are financial aid forms. T is accounts receivable, S is a student, H is human resources, F is finance, etc. The second letter identifies the module this form is stored in, which I just walked you through. So RAP Rewards in the packaging and disbursement module, so it gets a P. The third letter identifies what type of form it is. Is it about a student application? Is it a report or an inquiry? Or is it a rule? And then the last four letters are an abbreviation for what the form actually is. So in RAP Awards case, it stands for Applicants Awards. Another example might be ROA Inst, which would be Institutional Options. RABUD, which stands for Applicant Budget. ROSDIF, which stands for User Defined Fields. Now some keyboard shortcuts. So you can use Tab to go into the next item. Control page down will get you to the next block, and be careful, on some forms there's actually a couple of hidden next blocks that you can access. I'm thinking specifically of ROA and Roll. F6 is insert a new record, so if you'd like to leave a comment by using your keyboard, you just hit F6 and it will insert a new comment. F7 you use to start a search, then F8 you can use to execute the search. F10 would be save changes. And then, if you are one of the lucky few in the office that actually write Argos reports, you can shift and double-click into any field and find the name of the table through dynamic help query. So that's really helpful if you write Argos reports. Other cool forms that are ISU specific, that means they're modified, so OIT set them up so they don't come in any menu structure with Banner. So the GZA image is how you look at somebody's photo ID. Z-Track we use to make scholarship awards before we actually do our New Year setup. GUA user preferences is how you change your background color. You may have noticed that mine is green in this presentation. GUA personal menu is how you set up your shortcuts. So if you have a couple of forms like these, for example, that are not housed in any menus anywhere that you could just never remember how to get to, you can set that up using the menu. And then of course, SZA institutional records is how we look at the grades and drops that students initiate for their academic record. And then our new one, GPA proxy, is where students authorize a proxy user to view their account. That's the end. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a fabulous training and farewell.